Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm testing the first 4th generation WOLED gaming monitor to hit my workbench, the Asus ROG Strix XG27AQWMG. A fairly uninspiring name for what is otherwise a very exciting and interesting display. This monitor utilizes LG's primary RGB Tandem technology for the first time, promising a suite of improvements to brightness, colors, and power consumption. In addition, we get Asus's true black glossy coating and strong feature set, so this one might just tick all the boxes. In terms of specifications, the XG27AQWMG is a 27-inch 2560x1440W OLED with a maximum refresh rate of 280Hz, so it's in direct competition with the latest QD-OLEDs at a similar refresh. It has adaptive sync technology, of course, along with Display HDR True Black 500 certification, a step higher than competing QD-OLEDs that are just True Black 400. This means that, at least on paper, we can expect higher brightness than previous panels.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ugreen and their brand new Nexode 300-watt power bank. This beefy unit can deliver 140 watts of charging power via a single USB-C port with bidirectional capability, allowing for a full recharge of the power bank itself in just an hour and a half. With 5 ports in total, this power bank can charge 5 devices simultaneously, and with a massive 48,000 mAh capacity, you can fully recharge an iPhone 15 Pro over 9 times. The Nexode 300-watt also features a built-in LED light with 3 modes, including SOS, making it perfect for weekend camping trips. With a smart LED display that provides real-time data on remaining power and current usage, and automotive-grade lithium iron phosphate batteries that retain over 80% capacity after 3,000 cycles, you can rely on this power bank for all of your charging needs. So for more information on the Nexode 300 power bank and the rest of Ugreen's portable lineup, please check the links in the video description.
So what is 4th generation WOLED technology, and what is this whole primary RGB tandem thing? Well, primary RGB tandem refers to an updated emissive layer design that forms the cornerstone of 4th gen WOLED. OLEDs have many different layers, and some of those have layers within layers. In previous designs, the emissive layer used a stack of 3 emissive sources in a blue-yellow-blue configuration, ultimately generating white light that gets filtered into colors for 3 of the 4 subpixels. Primary RGB Tandem swaps out the yellow emissive source for a red and a green source in a new 4-stack blue-green-blue-red configuration. The emissive layer still generates white light, but LG claim this new approach produces higher peak and color brightness along with greater efficiency. Confusingly, LG also labeled 4th generation WOLED as Meta 3.0, an evolution on 3rd generation WOLED that used Meta 2.0. Compared to the previous generation, 4th gen WOLED removes the micro lens array as it's now been deemed unnecessary. There are different claimed performance improvements for primary RGB tandem WOLED between TVs and monitors. Asus for this monitor claimed 15% higher peak brightness, 25% wider color volume, and a difficult to test 60% longer OLED lifespan compared to previous WOLED monitors. What's interesting about this Asus monitor is that you wouldn't know this is a brand new and significantly improved generation of WOLED product by reading the name or even looking at the design. ROG Strix XG27AQWMG sounds incredibly similar to previous Asus OLEDs, and the design is very similar with the usual central box on the rear. If any OLED was worthy of a big brand overhaul, it was this one. The front is dominated by the 27-inch WOLED panel with mostly even bezels on all 4 sides. Below the screen is a small chin with an Asus logo, behind which is the directional control for the OSD. On the rear is a standard ROG Strix design with the thin OLED panel extending out from the box. The design of the box is fine, it's made from a few different plastics, and it's obviously on the gamer end of the spectrum. In one corner you get an ROG logo in a grid pattern with RGB LED lighting. My unit had a small mark on the front bezel edge, which is because apparently Asus sent this final production model to me directly from their labs or something. So anyway, that's why that mark's there. Like we saw with the XG32UCWMG a few weeks ago, the XG27AQWMG has moved to a smaller stand base. It's a small flat metal plate which looks great and still provides an excellent level of stability. This new approach maximizes available desk space and allows for many keyboard positions, plus it still allows you to put items on top of the base. I really like this design trend, it makes a lot of sense, and the use of metal adds a premium touch. Connectivity is average here. There's one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports, and a 2-port USB hub. There's no USB-C input and no KVM switch. Both types of display inputs support 10-bit 1440p 280Hz, DisplayPort with DSC, and HDMI without. The monitor also accepts and downscales up to a 4K 120Hz input over HDMI, which might be useful for console gamers. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle, which can be found behind the Asus logo on the front of the display. We're getting the same interface and feature set as the very latest OLEDs from Asus, so this display has one of the most feature-rich offerings on the market. I'll talk about some of these features in just a little bit, but there's lots of stuff in here for gaming, adjusting colors, and managing the various OLED care settings. 4th generation WOLED shifts all 1440p panels across to using the new RGB subpixel layout. This is a separate improvement to primary RGB Tandem, but still important for improving text quality compared to earlier 1440p WOLEDs that used RWBG. It's not the first time we've seen RGB on a 1440p WOLED. This layout first debuted on the 27-inch 1440p 480Hz panel last year. However, with 4th gen, it's now coming to the more affordable 280Hz refresh rate as well. This change in subpixel structure improves text quality compared to previous 1440p WOLEDs. It's not a perfect solution, but text is clearer and closer in appearance to an LCD in most circumstances, with less horizontal shadowing. There is still some shadowing and artifacts related to the inclusion of the white subpixel, particularly at smaller font sizes, so this panel isn't quite at the level of an LCD. However, I'd say it's reasonably good for a bit of web browsing or document editing. This makes WOLED at this resolution more competitive with QD-OLED. Whether or not it reaches parity with triangle RGB QD-OLED is subjective and even dependent on things like font and text size. QD-OLED has its own issues with pink-green fringing above and below text, so neither panel is artifact-free. I don't have strong thoughts here on which is better. I might slightly prefer QD-OLED, but really neither is quite as crisp as an IPS LCD, and in general it's usable for desktop tasks and a non-issue while gaming. The XG27AQWMG also uses Asus's new True Black glossy coating, which we first saw a few weeks back on the XG32UCWMG. This is not the same glossy coating as Asus used last year on the WOLED-based XG27AQDMG. Yeah, slight difference in name there. This new glossy version shifts from a 3% haze to a 0% haze, leading to even better clarity that's closer in look to a WOLED TV. Asus also claims a significant reduction in ambient reflections, and in a side-by-side it certainly appears as though the strength of reflections has been reduced. What's interesting is the True Black coating on this panel isn't identical to True Black on the 32-inch 4K panel. This is because the 32-inch 4K panel is a 3rd gen WOLED with a different layer composition to this new 4th gen primary RGB Tandem panel. The two finishes are very similar, but the new 4th gen panel has better direct reflection handling that reduces the brightness of reflections. The new panel also reflects with a more neutral color tone, as opposed to the 3rd gen WOLED panels, which produce a slight purple tint to the reflected light. Might be a little hard to see on camera, but it's there in person. It's a subtle difference, but it's an improvement. Most other 1440p WOLED panels have used a matte finish, including Asus's previous flagship 1440p 480Hz model. Going from matte to glossy has some benefits and some trade-offs. The big benefit is clarity. There's no coating grain, the screen looks crystal clear, and colors appear to pop more, which is a common advantage when comparing glossy to matte. Light doesn't diffuse across the surface of the screen either, which in the right conditions can give it a high contrast appearance with deeper blacks. The trade-off is direct reflections. The screen no longer diffuses reflected light, so the surface is more like a mirror. The coating and layer structure do a good job of minimizing most reflections, but anything bright tends to cut through and present as a defined reflected object. This can be distracting if you have objects or lights in front of the screen at angles that cause reflections, so you wouldn't want to put this screen opposite a window. I personally really like the glossy finish and prefer it to matte, but the coating that's most suitable for you will depend on your setup. This True Black finish is excellent in darker rooms and quite good in moderately lit environments as well, but it may require some optimization of your setup to minimize reflections. Matte, on the other hand, works better in situations where reflections may be a problem, such as in a brighter room or where you have less control over lighting and have to use the screen in a specific position. In a sense, matte is a safer bet, whereas glossy has more risk but is a bigger payoff. The other main comparison is to QD-OLED glossy. Again, there's strengths and weaknesses to each approach, but the biggest and most obvious difference is the way each panel handles ambient light. QD-OLED has notorious issues with ambient light reflection in brighter rooms, which causes blacks to appear grey, and this hurts the black depth advantage you get from OLED technology. True black glossy WOLED, on the other hand, does not have this issue, so in rooms with moderate to bright lighting, the true black WOLED panel delivers deeper blacks and a higher apparent contrast ratio. On the other hand, glossy QD-OLED is the stronger of the two for handling direct reflections. Both options have a mirror-like finish, but QD-OLED does a better job of reducing the brightness of reflections so they don't cut through as much as on the true black WOLED. In the worst cases, you'll see defined reflections on either panel, but in a side-by-side comparison, QD-OLED reflections are nearly always less obvious. It's also worth noting that in a dark or dimly lit room, there is basically no difference between either coating. Ultimately, the question is whether glossy QD-OLED or true black glossy WOLED is better. I think most people will prefer the true black glossy finish, and I think it's more versatile and usable in a wider range of conditions. In moderately lit rooms, either with artificial or natural light, QD-OLED ambient light reflection is quite obvious, and you just don't get that on glossy WOLED, which makes WOLED a better choice for gaming both at night and during the day. There is a greater risk of direct reflections on WOLED, but I think that's easier to mitigate and avoid than QD-OLED ambient light reflection. That's just my opinion though. Screen coatings can be quite subjective, so again, it depends on your setup and how you use your monitor. OLED panels of all varieties are susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burned in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day, and you can check out our ongoing OLED burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a monitor for hours of work. Asus offer an industry-standard 3-year burn-in warranty. The AQWMG also features Asus's Neo proximity sensor, which we first saw on the PG27 UCDM earlier this year. This is a proximity sensor that detects when you aren't sitting in front of the display and automatically turns the screen black, preventing burn-in. After all, there's no point displaying anything when you aren't there to view it. It has adjustable timing and sensitivity settings, and in my testing it just works really well. If you leave your seat, it turns the screen off after a few minutes, sit back down, and it instantly turns back on. It's not a gimmick, I think it's a great feature that strengthens Asus's OLED offering. Response time performance is excellent on this WOLED monitor. This display technology offers lightning-fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark, and performance doesn't change at lower refresh rates, one of the many benefits of OLED for variable refresh rate gamers. Unlike with some LCDs, you don't need to adjust settings depending on the refresh rate you are using. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this WOLED and other OLED monitors, including QD-OLED variants. OLEDs are much faster than LCDs and have benefits such as no overshoot artifacts, consistent performance across the refresh rate range, and cumulative deviation indicative of near-ideal behavior. With transition times an order of magnitude faster, OLEDs have around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity over an LCD at the same refresh rate. This means a 280Hz OLED offers a similar experience to a 420Hz LCD. Aside from comparisons to LCDs, the main thing you need to be aware of when buying an OLED for motion is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using while gaming is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with a 240Hz max refresh and one with a 280Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120fps with the 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you use the highest refresh rate capabilities. When comparing a 280Hz OLED to a 240Hz OLED though, which are both in the same price range, there's not a huge difference when gaming at the maximum refresh. 280Hz is slightly clearer, but with just a 17% increase in refresh rate, it's not a game changer, and I think most people will struggle to notice the difference. I don't think you should pay much of a premium to access 280Hz over 240Hz, though of course it's certainly better to have. Asus offer two additional features that are of interest. One is ELMB black frame insertion. This feature works at a 120Hz signal input to boost clarity up to the level of 240Hz. It does this by technically running at 240Hz but displaying every second frame as black. No other refresh rate configurations are supported, and to enable ELMB you have to disable adaptive sync, uniform brightness, and HDR. As ELMB is supported only in a very specific configuration, it's quite a niche feature, but it does work, and enhances the motion clarity of 120Hz gaming to look like 240Hz. It's not as advanced as backlight strobing on most LCDs, which use a shorter backlight pulse to achieve much clearer motion clarity than eLMB on this OLED can provide. It's a nice bonus feature, though not something I would personally use in most gaming sessions. The second feature is OLED anti-flicker, designed to combat variable refresh rate flicker in rare scenarios. It does this by reducing the VRR range through raising the minimum refresh rate. The various settings are off with a minimum refresh rate of 48Hz, middle with a minimum refresh of 120Hz, and high with a minimum of 210Hz. Low frame rate compensation, which allows for an effective refresh rate range of 0 to 280Hz, is only available on middle or with the setting disabled, so to prevent tearing and a jarring loss of smoothness, I would not use the high mode. TFT Central have a great article exploring OLED flicker, why it occurs, and how this anti-flicker mode helps to minimize it. Essentially, on WOLED panels, gamma is tied to refresh rate. Large swings in refresh rate cause visible gamma shifts, which can be perceived as flicker. Narrowing the VRR range reduces the total amplitude of gamma swings during periods of frame rate fluctuation, but doesn't fully eliminate the issue. This aligns with what we've experienced using these modes. Asus anti-flicker mode reduces the severity of flicker, but it doesn't fully eliminate the issue. Input latency is excellent at the maximum refresh rate, offering a sub 1 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with a fast response time and a decent refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use. The only way to achieve better latency is through a higher refresh rate model, for example one of the latest 500Hz options. However, the processing delay in the fixed 60Hz mode is quite long at 23 milliseconds, so that could do with improvement via a firmware update, as I found it noticeable using that configuration. LG Display claim this new 4th generation WOLED panel is more efficient, and that appears to be true when testing full white power consumption. Previous WOLEDs used about 50 watts to display 200 nits full white, and that's cut to just 36 watts on the AQWMG. That's a 28% reduction on the previous models and a reduction of over 40% compared to similar QD-OLEDs. However, power consumption while gaming is a little different. In our mid-APL test, this panel used 27 watts, which is just a 12% improvement on previous 240Hz WOLEDs like the AQDMG. It does end up the most efficient OLED, narrowly outperforming QD-OLED, but it doesn't appear the strong gains seen in white efficiency have materialized when viewing a colorful mid-APL game in Horizon Forbidden West that is largely absent of pure white on screen. 4th generation WOLED brings the first major improvement to color space coverage that we've seen from this technology. Previous panels typically hit around 97% DCI-P3 coverage. That's been bumped up to 99.8% with this new WOLED, and the difference is even larger when we look at the full Rec 2020 HDR gamut. Last gen WOLEDs all sat in the 72% range, while this new primary RGB Tandem WOLED leaps forward to offer 83.8% coverage, which is right up there with the best monitors I've tested, including LCDs. This is a slightly wider color gamut than QD OLEDs, which were previously the leading OLED technology for color space coverage, and it certainly eliminates the gap in saturation between the two options. Factory calibration is pretty standard for this type of OLED panel with this level of gamut coverage. A grayscale Delta E ITP average of 7.48 isn't that bad, but it's also not amazing, largely due to too high of a gamma in the darker grayscale range and a slightly red color temperature tint. Like a lot of wide gamut gaming monitors, the color space is left unclamped for SDR use by default, leading to oversaturation in content like YouTube videos, and you might see that as skin tones being a little sunburnt in look. Compared to other monitors, these results are firmly in the middle of the pack. The AQWMG works well with Windows 11 Auto Color Management, as the display reports the correct color primaries to Windows, leading to 98.6% sRGB coverage in this mode. While grayscale results are largely unaffected compared to default performance, saturation and color checker both improve noticeably to now deliver great calibration. This is definitely one viable way of improving performance in the SDR mode. The other is to use the monitor's built-in sRGB modes. Asus allow you to change the color space to sRGB in the settings while keeping everything else unlocked. Or you can use the dedicated sRGB Cal mode, which is the most accurate. In fact, this sRGB mode is very well calibrated, bringing a performance improvement in grayscale and outstanding results in the color tests. Compared to other monitors, this is a great result in grayscale, with performance near the top of the chart, matching the better WOLED and QD OLEDs I've tested. Color checker results are outstanding, so there's really no reason to perform any further SDR calibration. Yes, you can improve things slightly using CalMAD and an ICC profile, but personally, I would just use the sRGB Cal mode or one of the unlocked configurations if I needed to adjust these settings. SDR brightness is noticeably higher from this new 4th Gen WOLED panel than previous options. Full screen white brightness increases to 331 nits, up from about 260 nits previously. This is a 26% increase over the AQWMG model from last year, and finally puts WOLED in the lower part of the LCD brightness range. This is a big win for people that like a bright monitor, either because they use it in a bright room or because they want to cut through reflections. This new panel is also 10% brighter than the 1440p 500Hz QD-OLED panel that was introduced a few months ago, which isn't a significant difference, but it does mean WOLED can claim the crown in this metric. Asus offer a uniform brightness setting which is not enabled by default and caps the monitor to around this 331 nit level for all window sizes, rather than varying brightness as you resize windows, behavior that I find annoying. Minimum brightness is great at 29 nits despite the increase to max brightness. Viewing angles from this WOLED panel are great, no concerns there whatsoever. Typically what you are getting is better than what you'll see from an LCD. Uniformity was perfectly fine when viewing white, but this 4th Gen panel does not improve grey uniformity substantially, so there is still some banding and dirty screen effect when viewing uniform dark grey backgrounds. This is not an issue you'll see with QD-OLED, and it can be visible in some desktop apps that use dark grey for the interface. The XG27AQWMG is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels, including WOLED, directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high-contrast scenarios and allows for a clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per-pixel control, but zone backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. The AQWMG uses a pretty standard Asus set of HDR configurations. There are 4 HDR modes, then a separate toggle called Adjustable HDR, which when enabled allows you to increase brightness and change other settings. You can see the differences between the various modes here, tested using a 2% window size. By default, so with Adjustable HDR disabled, all offer peak brightness of around 550 nits. The Console HDR and Display HDR 500 True Black modes both have stricter roll-off, which is good if you want the source device to perform most of the tone mapping. The Gaming HDR and Cinema HDR modes have more gentle roll-off at higher brightness, which can be better in certain circumstances. The Gaming, Cinema and Console modes all report peak brightness of 1060 nits to Windows, whereas the True Black mode reports 408 nits to Windows, regardless of whether Adjustable HDR is enabled or not. Both of these figures are wrong, given the True Black mode is actually designed for over 500 nits of peak brightness at small window sizes, and the maximum capabilities in the other modes exceed 1060 nits. With Adjustable HDR enabled and brightness set to the maximum of 100, we now see peak brightness reach around 1200 nits at a 2% window size in the Gaming, Cinema and Console modes, with the same roll-off characteristics we saw previously. The True Black mode can be increased to 700 nits. All of these configurations have some over-brightening, so let's take a closer look at console HDR mode performance. With Adjustable HDR disabled, so the default console HDR experience, accuracy is excellent in all configurations, but brightness is capped to around 550 nits. We've seen a lot of these True Black type configurations across OLED monitors we've tested. This one is definitely brighter than what you'll find on most QD OLEDs, but still, it doesn't have especially amazing peak brightness capabilities. With adjustable HDR enabled and brightness manually increased to 100, now we see 1200 nits of peak brightness at small window sizes, and I actually recorded up to 1400 nits at a 1% window. The trade-off is in darker, lower APL content, there is some over-brightening for midtones and up. Shadows are still very accurate in terms of brightness, so this isn't a full over-brightening like we see from some QD-OLED boosted brightness modes, but once you hit elements that are supposed to be 70 nits or higher, brightness boosting kicks in. The good news is that this over-brightening only occurs in some types of dark content, so its impact is limited. 10% APL 18 testing is still measuring relatively dark content, but this brightness boosting effect is reduced compared to testing at 2%. This issue then disappears entirely when testing other configurations, including brighter, high APL content, where we see no substantial amounts of panel dimming. This is excellent news in comparison to QD-OLEDs, which do have problematic dimming in brighter scenes. This WOLED configuration is much better, as it only has issues with a specific range of low APL content. Sure, it's not the perfect result, but it's highly usable and not frustratingly annoying like with QD-OLEDs. In synthetic brightness tests, we see a strong result for an OLED in full screen white brightness. This new WOLED panel hits 320 nits, which is about the same as the latest 500Hz QD-OLEDs. In a more appropriate comparison, this is the brightest 280Hz-ish OLED you can get. It's 19% brighter than the AW2725D QD-OLED and the previous AQWMG OLED. We're still miles off LCDs, but this is a noticeable improvement for WOLED technology. Interestingly, 10% window brightness has decreased to 578 nits, down from 761 nits on previous WOLEDs. I'm not sure why this is the case, and it's disappointing among the WOLED family, but it's still high enough to beat QD-OLED, coming in 8% ahead of 500Hz QD-OLED and 22% ahead of lower refresh QD-OLED. 2% window results put the AQWMG on top with a result of 1244 nits. Asus claimed a 15% increase to peak brightness, though in this test I saw a 12% gain over the AQDMG model. That's not bad, as it means WOLED is at least 20% brighter than QD-OLED for small elements, including the 500Hz models. At a 1% size, I recorded up around 1400 nits, so theoretically that gap will widen in some situations. In brightness versus window size, we see pretty similar lines for each of the OLED options. The newer True Black 500 models have somewhat higher brightness at larger window sizes, but it gets pretty messy in that 2 to 10% range where each option trades blows. Generally though, 280Hz QD-OLED produces the weakest brightness, while this new WOLED is quite good. In real scene brightness, the AQWMG puts up a strong showing, as it's one of the brightest OLEDs we've tested in real-world content. Performance is interesting compared to previous gen WOLEDs like the AQDMG though, because it isn't always the case that the new primary RGB Tandem panel is brighter. Peak brightness in one of our tests was 21% brighter, and high APL brightness was between 15 and 40% brighter. But then in other tests, the old panel could be 10 to 20% brighter. This is probably due to what we saw in brightness versus window size, where the older panel did have an advantage at some of the smaller sizes, though the new panel beats it at either extreme. This resulted in just a 5% brightness increase across our tests on average. Compared to QD-OLED, there are a range of positive results. Firstly, up against a 280Hz QD-OLED like the Dell AW2725D, the AQWMG has much stronger performance. Comparing the brightest configuration of the AQWMG to the Peak 1000 mode of the AW2725D, the AQWMG delivers up to 90% higher brightness in high APL scenes. This is because the panel itself is brighter and it has no panel dimming issues in the mode that delivers high peak brightness. The WOLED panel trades blows with the QD-OLED in low APL peak brightness, but demolishes it in brighter scenes, and this is without changing modes. Of course, you could put the AW2725D into its true black mode, which narrows the high APL margin to about 15% in favor of the WOLED, but that mode nerfs low APL brightness, which is not the case on WOLED, so you can easily see how WOLED has much better brightness behavior. Compared to the newer 500Hz QD-OLED panel running in its Peak 1000 mode, the AQWMG defeats it easily in high APL content with up to a 50% brightness advantage and no panel dimming. There are some tests where the QD-OLED delivers higher peak brightness, but in other situations, the two are similarly matched. While both panels have a similar average level of brightness, the fact that AQWMG does this with much better accuracy and no panel dimming puts it easily ahead. Then there are specific cases like MSI's EOTF Boost mode. This mode on the 500Hz QD-OLED delivers similar to better brightness performance than the AQWMG, but as it's a hack, it doesn't actually solve panel dimming, as seen in the test results, and it has annoying dynamic behavior. The AQWMG's results are more accurate and more consistent, which is why I believe it has the best peak brightness characteristics of any OLED monitor I've tested to date. To go along with a wider color gamut, LG have managed to increase color brightness a bit, but not by enough to close the gap meaningfully on QD-OLED. Single subpixel color brightness, so pure red, green, and blue, is up by 8 to 20% compared to the older AQDMG model with a last-gen panel. However, what's interesting is that two subpixel colors like cyan, magenta, and yellow have only increased when adjustable brightness is disabled for whatever reason. When accessing the maximum peak white brightness, for some reason, the two subpixel colors see little to no increase in brightness. But when using the other configuration, they increase by 6 to 21%. This seems like an area that needs fixing, as surely the peak brightness configuration should also offer the best color brightness in all situations. Compared to QD-OLED, these results are still well down though. Best case versus best case, there are still situations where QD-OLED colors can be upwards of 90% brighter. Color brightness is always tricky to talk about because a result of 70 nits for blue, as an example, is actually not dim, but it sounds that way relative to white brightness results. What these results say is that WOLED is producing color brightness in line with what is expected for a 500 nit white level, whereas QD-OLED is producing color brightness in line with a 1000 nit white level, which is the actual peak brightness capability of the panel. With WOLED, really only that white subpixel is boosted to hit over 1000 nits, the rest of the colors don't get boosted to the same degree. This can impact scenes which have small, bright, colorful elements where you would expect peak brightness to be above 500 nits white equivalent. The difference between QD-OLED and WOLED is less impactful outside of that, where WOLED is still able to deliver decent color brightness. Overall color volume is up 18% comparing this WOLED panel to previous WOLED, so not quite at the 25% Asus quote, but they might be using a different testing metric. QD-OLED is still in the leading position with a 15% higher color volume. Previously though, there was a 37% gap between QD-OLED and WOLED, so it's narrowed this generation. Across the accuracy test, the AQWMG has excellent calibration for HDR content, and this is largely true whether you use the default or brightness 100 configurations. It's a great looking panel with fantastic brightness characteristics. In the essentials checklist, I don't have a full final spec sheet from Asus, but I do have a few bits and pieces which so far have been accurate. I can't verify the claim that this new WOLED panel will have a 60% longer lifespan than previous models, but the claims around higher peak brightness and wider color volume are close to the mark. Like the XG32UCWMG that I reviewed recently, I think the XG27AQWMG has a terrible name. It's unnecessarily long and difficult to remember, mostly because Asus have a ton of monitors with very similar names. The previous generation model is the XG27AQDMG, just a single letter difference in the middle of the last word in the name. And it's a major product overhaul that brings significantly improved capabilities. Surely this monitor deserved a very different and unique name so that buyers could easily remember it and buy it. Instead, if you get one of those letters wrong, you might end up with a totally different product. In the feature support matrix, we get a pretty good showing. Some of the key things this monitor offers are black frame insertion support, no panel dimming in the HDR mode, a wide color gamut, and an unlocked sRGB mode. Some of the notable misses are the omission of USB-C and a KVM switch, a long processing delay in the 60Hz mode, and the moderate potential for flickering. Overall, the Asus ROG Strix XG27AQWMG is the best 1440p 280-ish Hz OLED gaming monitor. The new 4th generation primary RGB Tandem WOLED panel from LG Display is a significant leap forward for WOLED technology, and paired with Asus's true black glossy coating, we end up with a monitor that on the balance of things outperforms QD-OLED. At the right price, this is going to be the definitive 1440p OLED choice for most gamers. LG Display have put in a lot of work with this panel to close the gap to QD-OLED in specific weaknesses while maintaining the strengths of WOLED. In SDR content, this is the brightest panel you can get, pushing up to 330 nits. QD-OLED only offers that in their premium 500Hz panel. In HDR content, we also see over 300 nits in bright scenes and up to 1400 nits peak, with some real-world results exceeding QD-OLED peak performance. It does all of this in one reasonably accurate mode without any of the frustrating panel dimming you get with QD-OLED. In this sort of refresh rate range, this 4th Gen WOLED clearly offers the best brightness experience, and I'd probably put it ahead of the best QD-OLEDs too. But it's not just brightness that is improved here. The better RGB subpixel layout has been brought across from the premium 480Hz panel, improving text clarity and closing that gap with QD-OLED. The color gamut is noticeably wider, now beating QD-OLED in Rec 2020 coverage, and while color volume and color brightness is still in favor of QD-OLED, the gap has narrowed. This panel is also more efficient than previous WOLEDs, a nice bonus that will hopefully lead to better longevity, as Asus claim. Then we get to the screen coating. I don't think we'll see glossy used on all primary RGB Tandem WOLEDs, but what Asus have done with True Black Glossy on this screen is excellent. For most users, it offers a clearly better experience than QD-OLED because it doesn't suffer from raised blacks in bright environments. It has fantastic clarity with no grain, and black depth in most conditions is excellent. QD-OLED still has an edge in reducing direct reflections, and maybe matte will be better for specific use cases where bright reflections will be an issue. But I think this is the best available surface coating on a 1440p OLED right now. I think the strengths to this monitor are clear when you think about the weaknesses of QD-OLED. Panel dimming in bright HDR content. You don't get that here with no major trade-offs. Raised blacks in bright environments. This panel has a better coating where that isn't an issue. Relatively low SDR brightness. This new WOLED is 30% brighter. Meanwhile, WOLED weaknesses like color volume, subpixel layout, and, at least for some people, the matte coating, are all improved with the XG27AQWMG. And there's plenty more good stuff to talk about here. Motion performance at 280Hz is very good and well suited to a wide variety of games. Asus offer fantastic factory calibration through their included sRGB mode, along with many adjustable settings in both the SDR and HDR modes. We're also seeing the latest Asus extras like ELMB black frame insertion, the anti-flicker modes, and the Neo proximity sensor, all of which are useful in certain circumstances. This is a monitor packed with plenty of features and great performance. The only thing I don't have to discuss right now is the price, which is a key component of our reviews. For that reason, I might call this a preview until I have final pricing information, but basically I got this display before going away on holiday and tested everything about a week before this video NDA expires and the video goes live.
Okay, Steve here. Tim finally got pricing info for the Asus XG27AU. One moment, please. XG27AQWMG. Okay. For the Asus XG27AU. XG27AQWMG. Okay. Got it now. For the Asus XG27AQWMG. I'm done. I'm out. I'm done.
I just saw a very frustrated Steve walking out, so I guess I got to do this. I'm just editing the video, but anyway, don't worry, Tim. I got you covered. Even if I am just relaying the information you received while in transit to some exotic location. We did just hear a couple of days ago that the MSRP is $699 US. Now, Tim was expecting $600 and probably would recommend the monitor if it was that price, but it's not. Now, Tim thinks $699 is a little expensive, but not totally outrageous given the capabilities. At that price, we'd suggest you wait to see what the Gigabyte model offers at $500 in the not too distant future. Now, Asus says their model won't be available until early Q4 anyway, so you've got plenty of time to sit on the decision and wait to see what the competition brings to the table. Also, as a side note, at this price range, you're starting to compete with 360Hz monitors, and then it becomes a battle of what sort of things you actually want out of your monitor. While it's a very good offering from Asus and has meaningful improvements over previous models, it will all come down to the competition.
So anyway, that's it for this quite long review. Lots to get through with this one and the new primary RGB Tandem panel because of all of the changes and stuff. Yeah, plenty of stuff to get through. So hopefully you've all enjoyed it, learned something. And if you are thinking about purchasing this monitor because of our reviews, we've got links to buy all the products that we've talked about in the description below, as well as check pricing. Those things can change months or weeks after this review went live. So yeah, we also have a Patreon page. Links are in the description for that as well. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits. Check all those things out on our Patreon page. But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.